Well, hello everyone. So, look, I don't know how many people who are on here this evening were on the class, the discussion last Saturday when we discussed Benjamin Franklin and the whole question of a a Republican identity of what real American culture is. I'm not going to go back over any of that tonight. And I'm issuing a warning here that the title of this presentation is The Oligarchy's Cultural Assault on America. And this is not a pretty picture. Hopefully by the end of the presentation, everyone won't be completely depressed. But I want to sort of give people, and this is by no means in depth. There's not anywhere near enough time to present an in-depth picture of this, but just give people a sense of the deliberate destruction of culture in the United States in the deepest sense of culture. And How this has been going on for really more than 100 years. It is a long-term project of the oligarchy. Now, I'm going to begin with just something a little bit slightly autobiographical because, you know, if there are young people on the call tonight, a lot of young people really don't like the baby boomers very much, or have a lot of resentment about the baby boomer generation, which is fine. But I want to give people a sense of what was done, because that's my generation, and really what some of what we were subjected to, um, which brought about the terrible results that it did. So, just a little story. When I was a junior in high school, I was 16 years old. I had an English teacher who thought that she should try to, enlighten the students and present the students with more challenging material. So she had us read a short story by J.D. Salinger called A Perfect Day for Banana Fish, which was actually, I believe, the first published story that Salinger published. It's published in the New Yorker. Without going through the whole story, essentially it's about this character, Seymour Glass, who sort of wanders around, sits on the beach, talks to young girls, and basically goes through sort of a meaningless day, and then goes back to his motel room and shoots himself in the head, dead, um, with his wife in bed next to him, asleep. And that's how the story ends. Now, it turns out that, and Salinger admitted this later, that this story was actually modeled on a story that had been written 30 years earlier by F. Scott Fitzgerald called Mayday, which was published in a magazine called Smart Set in 1920. And this is about a group of Yale graduates who are in New York City, and there's a lot going on. Again, a very involved plot. But essentially, they go through a series of somewhat meaningless experiences. And then the protagonist of the story goes to his hotel room and shoots himself in the head. And that's how that story ends. Now, that was, when I was a junior. Then, when I was a senior in high school, I had a different English teacher who wanted to introduce some of us to, more advanced 20th century literature. So he had us read Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. And, without going through the whole plot of A Farewell to Arms, it is, a fairly gruesome story. And it ends with the heroine of the story dying and the protagonist of the story holding her in his arms, and that's how it ends with, her dead, him holding on to her, and the story ends, in one of absolute despair. Now, one of the interesting things about that, besides Farewell to Arms itself, is that 6 years earlier, we read this story in this book, I think in 1968, and 6 years earlier, Ernest Hemingway had shot himself in the head. So you might be picking up a pattern here, right? Of people shooting themselves in the head. And somehow this is the great literature which is given to high school students, at least in my high school, in the 1960s, as what we should investigate as great literature. Now, also when I was a senior uh, in high school, believe it or not, the same teacher, English teacher, had us read the novel or novella by Albert Camus, The Stranger, which in which well, I'm not even going to try to replicate the plot, but it ends up with the protagonist of the story getting his head cut off, being guillotined. And that's how that book ends. So, this is the kind of stuff that was given to us to read. And the fact is, if you look at um, a lot of the stuff that was pushed on high school students and college students in the 1960s and 70s, writers like Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald, William Faulkner, for the more advanced people like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, James Joyce, it is literature of despair, that life is meaningless, that it is, unbelievably pessimistic all the way through it. And this is what was, championed as the great American literature and foreign literature. People like James Joyce and T.S. Eliot. Um, for the more adventurous in the 60s and 70s, you had things like uh, Louis Ferdinand Céline's Journey to the End of the Night, which to this day is hailed as one of the greatest pieces of literature in the 20th century. And in fact, if you were to look at the New York Review of Books or some big literary or academic, group of experts, and they were to put together a list of the greatest novels of the 20th century, Journey to the End of the Night is always on this list, often in the top 10. And this is an absolutely insane story, involving fraud, lunacy, murder. Again, absolute and total despair about the human condition, about what it means to be human. And and then there were many others that could be mentioned as well, in the theater and elsewhere. So, well, I'll mention some of the names, Jean Cocteau and Anton Artaud, Jean Genet, and many others, and this was all the rage, on the college campuses back in the 60s and 70s. I don't know how much this stuff is produced today. It might still be produced somewhere. I'm sure if you go to advanced literature classes in any university in the United States, this stuff is still taught. This is the great literature of the 20th century, where in fact, most of the people involved in this, most of the people writing this stuff belonged in mental institutions. And in fact, two of the things that are most striking about these writings and the people who wrote them is how many suicides there are in the writings, among the major characters, and how many of the authors at one time or another in their life were institutionalized at mental institutions. And it's a fairly significant number. Yet this is held forward as the great literature, the great culture, literary culture of the 20th century, down to the present day. Um, so, look, what that's just a short introduction. Now, to get into this, we're going to be talking about the assault on American culture, and the I want to begin with something that I'm not going to develop at all tonight. Maybe somewhere down the line in the future, we'll discuss some of this. But I do think it's important to introduce it because, last week we talked about Benjamin Franklin. We talked about the kind of Republican culture, patriotic Republican culture that emerged out of the American Revolution and the sense of self-identity of the new citizenry of this republic. And the reality is that this came under assault from the European oligarchy very, very early on. And the key the key attack really began with the French Revolution, which I'll get into a little bit more. But I do want to just mention, look, what you had, if you go back to the 1780s and 1790s, in the decade following, or the 2 decades following the American Revolution, decade and a half following the American Revolution, is you had real intellectual life going on in a number of American cities, particularly New York City, but also Philadelphia, Boston, several other locations. And there were people who were collaborating and fighting and struggling to develop a literary and artistic culture that was coherent with the principles of the American Revolution. And again, I'm only going to mention a few names, and I'm not going to discuss this really much in depth at all. But you had the novelist, Charles Brockden Brown. You had the playwright and artist, William Dunlap. You had a man named Elihu Hubbard Smith, who was a poet, a playwright, and actually composed music. You had a man named Joseph Denny, who published for quite a number of years the most influential literary journal in the United States. This is in the 1790s. This was called the Portfolio. And, many of these people began as Federalists. A lot of them were anti-slavery. They belonged to many of the New York ones were leaders in the Manumission Society in New York. And they were writing poetry, and there was a much broader network than just the people I mentioned. And they were writing poetry, and they were writing novels and short stories. Painting was being developed. And this is before, James Fenimore Cooper. This is before Edgar Allan Poe. This is right about the time of the American Revolution, and then during the presidency of George Washington, Washington's 8 years in office. And there was an intensive effort to to develop this sort of patriotic, Republican, artistic culture in the United States. Now, what happened, a lot of things happened, but the thing that particularly disrupted and disoriented all of this was the French Revolution. Um, and this, what occurred was a real operation. And I'm not trying to simplify it, and I'm not trying to just put it in the context of sort of conspiracy theories. But all I can really do here is just give you a few signposts, a few highlights of some of the things that happened. Um, Look, the Constitution was ratified in 1788. George Washington was sworn in, was inaugurated on April 30th, 1789. April 30th, 1789. 75 days after Washington's inauguration was the storming of the Bastille in Paris, which initiated the violent wave in France, which initiated the violent aspect of the French Revolution, which then very quickly escalated over the next 2, 3, 4 years. So this occurred almost simultaneously with Washington being sworn in as president. Now, what happened, and it's important to understand that both sides of this were British of the controversy that developed. This was entirely made in Britain, within the British oligarchy, within the British elites. A great controversy was created. In November of 1789, a man named Richard Price, who was a minister and other things, he published a work called A Discourse on the Love of Our Country. And this work was rabidly pro-French Revolution. Now, Price himself was a member of Lord Shelburne's Bowood Circle, and was very active in the Shelburne apparatus. He also became the patron and the sponsor of a woman named Mary Wollstonecraft. He published this in 1789, rabidly pro-French Revolution. He was answered several months later by Edmund Burke, who published something called Reflections on the Revolution in France. And this was a direct answer in which Burke attacks Price, attacks the French Revolution, and then Burke does something very, very sly, right? Which is, he says, there are two revolutions that we have to choose between, right? Now, neither of these two, in Burke's view, is the American Revolution. Burke says, on the one hand, we have the French Revolution, anarchy, chaos, bloodshed, mob democracy. And the alternative, which is what we must stand for, are the principles of the 1688 Glorious Revolution, which brought William and Mary to the throne of England. And that's how Burke counterposes it. That's your choice, right? Forget the American Revolution. Forget the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Forget Benjamin Franklin's lifelong work, or what George Washington is doing as president, because when Burke writes this, Washington is the president of the United States. Forget all that. You only have two choices: the French Revolution or the Glorious Revolution. And of course, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was the revolution which brought the Dutch monarchy to the throne of England and brought in the Anglo-Dutch or the Venetian Dutch banking and imperial structures into the city of London, with the founding of the Bank of England and many, many other things. This was the Anglo-Dutch takeover of London. And this is what Burke says is, you know, what has to be, we have to rally around. We have to rally around that, around the creation of the Anglo-Dutch Empire as the alternative to the French Revolution. Now, Burke was then answered in two other works, one by Mary Wollstonecraft. Now, this is the mother of Mary Shelley, the woman who married Percy Shelley. This is her mother. Um, she published a work called The Vindication of the Rights of Man. And then in 1791, Tom Paine published a work called The Rights of Man in 1791. So this is all within a 18 to 24 month period. Price, Burke, Wollstonecraft, Tom Paine, with Wollstonecraft and Tom Paine, rapidly defending the French Revolution. And, this debate, again, all of these people are British. I mean, for those who don't realize it, Tom Paine was never an American citizen. He was a British subject his entire life until he moved to France, renounced his British citizenship, if you want to call it that, and became a French citizen. But Tom Paine was a member of the British establishment. And all of this was carried out within the British establishment. But then this argument between Burke and Paine and Burke and Wollstonecraft was then brought in to the United States entirely with the intention of disorienting the American patriots who were a lot, who were trying to, develop this new Republican culture in America. And then in 1797, you had the publication by John Robison of Proofs of a Conspiracy. This is while Washington is still the president and is right at the end of his term. And, in which he says the entire French Revolution was created by, the Illuminati and these Masonic circles, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And again, Robison, what he's defending, see what Robison and these other people are defending is the British Empire. They're saying your choice is between the values of the French Revolution and the values of the British Empire. That's your choice. And this then was all brought into the United States. And all of this had a tremendously disorienting effect on people. And many of these people, including some of the ones that I mentioned, who were in New York and in Boston and elsewhere, got very disoriented. And some, endorsed Burke, others endorsed Tom Paine, and the whole thing got very, very confused. Now, I'm not going to go into this any more than I have right now. The only reason I'm taking 5 or 10 minutes to do this here is to give you a sense that this attack on the culture that was created during and following the American Revolution, this attack occurred very early, from very early on. The British were determined to eradicate the principles of the successful American Revolution. From very early on, they were determined to reimpose an oligarchical culture on the United States. And Franklin died in 1790, Benjamin Franklin. Washington died in 1797. These people were irreplaceable. And then, of course, Hamilton was assassinated not much later. And things became, as I said, a number of people did very good things, but also a number of people became pretty disoriented, in one degree or another. So look, to move on here, because there's a lot to cover. Um, yeah, some people might disagree with this because they like to point to people. They say, what about, Mendelssohn and Schumann, and what about, Schiller, who was still writing, and they point to things in the 19th century, even as late as Brahms and what have you, and they say, how can you call this a dark age? There were great people doing great things, and that's true. There were great people doing great things, but you have to look at the trajectory. You know, between 1789, the beginning of the French Revolution, and 1815, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, that's 26 years. Europe was drenched in blood, drenched in blood, millions dead, nations destroyed. Any hope of an American revolution in Europe destroyed. No hope, no chance that the principles of the American Revolution could then find root in Europe and flourish, and that we could see a new republic like the American Republic develop in Europe. This was all gone. And, you had, after 1815, the Holy Alliance, led by Austria and other landed oligarchs. You had the global hegemony of the British Empire. And the 19th century is the century of imperial rule. And throughout the 19th century, what we see is a step by step by step imposition of bestial oligarchical culture on Europe. One of the aspects of this was the Romantic movement, which Heinrich Heine talks about in his book, The Romantic School in Germany, and how this was done, where classical principles, and don't just think of them in terms of artistic principles or musical principles. What you're really talking about here is a sense of optimism about the human condition. A culture based on optimism of the future. Think of the American Declaration of Independence, where this is wiped out. This is wiped out, and these existential romantic movements begin to spread. And by the late 19th century, this is very widespread. And you get, people like Kierkegaard and Nietzsche and many others. A lot of people like to focus on Nietzsche, God is dead and all of that. But he was just one of a whole grouping of these people who essentially said, there are no higher principles. That there that life essentially has no purpose. Life is meaningless. It's only what we experience. We're just animals. It's all completely irrational. This is what, some people call nihilism, if I'm pronouncing that right. Later, it develops into, existentialism, which is a very broad umbrella term. But the whole idea is that there is no purpose for being a human being. There is no meaning to your life. That you cannot play a positive, creative role in creating a better future. And this is what was spread all over Europe. And the by the late 19th century, this begins to then explode in art, in literature, in music, into absolute bestiality into pessimism, into an all-out attack on the creative human identity. Now, I'm going to talk tonight about Tom Wolfe, the American writer. I'll say a little bit more about him later. But he, one of the points he makes in his writings is that if you go back to the period around 1890, 1900, 1910, the 2 or 3 decades preceding World War I, this is when this existentialist, nihilist, artistic movement really gets going in a big way, all sponsored by the European elites and oligarchy. This is when it gets going in a very big way. And, the point that Wolfe makes is that the purpose behind all of this was one of destruction. And this was stated explicitly. I mean, one of the things that's sort of funny, if you look at say 1900, 1910, 1920, and 1930, is a lot of these people involved in these artistic movements, architecture movements, literary movements. A lot of them issued manifestos, revolutionary manifestos. This is the purpose of what we are doing. This is why we're making the revolution in art and music that we're making. Manifestos, which had never been done before. I mean, Leonardo da Vinci never wrote a manifesto. Beethoven never wrote a manifesto. But all of a sudden you get these manifestos around the time of the First World War, just before it, just after it. And in these manifestos, they're very explicit. What they say is that we are out to eradicate old, outmoded values, the classical traditions, the values of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is enemy number one. The values of the bourgeoisie, we're going to wipe this all out. We're going to create a new revolutionary culture in which nothing from the old culture is left standing. Nothing is left standing. It's wiped off the map. And this is what they begin to do. Now, and the essential message from all of this is that there are no truths, there are no eternal truths like, all men are created equal. There are no higher principles. God is dead. Life is meaningless, and this is the basic message. So what I want to do now is I'm going to run through, I'm going to show you some slides. In 1913,
I put up the first one.
let me just say this first.
Okay.
In 1913, an art exhibition opened in New York City. People were shocked by it. No one had ever seen anything like it before. It was called the International Exhibition of Modern Art, although it became known as the Armory Show. And this has generally been referred to as the dawn of modernism in American painting. And this was also the first time that the term avant-garde was used to describe painting and sculpture. Now, one of the artists who was featured at this exhibition, there were a number of them: Gauguin, Cézanne, Matisse, Picasso. But one of the ones who was featured was a man named Marcel Duchamp. And why don't you put up that painting, Tony, number one? There we go. This is a painting by Marcel Duchamp. It's entitled Nude Descending a Staircase, right? Nude Descending a Staircase. Nothing like this had ever been exhibited in New York City prior to 1913. one of the critics who was not enthusiastic about this painting described it in his review. He said it reminded him of an explosion in a shingle factory. Uh, but that is one of them. And the and very shortly thereafter, um, you know, a lot of other things were brought in, and this was the period from right before World War One to right after World War One, where Cubism was brought in. So why don't you put up the next painting? This is George Braque, one of the founders of Cubism. Um, I think this is about 1910, this painting. Put up the next one. This, I believe, is a self-portrait. I'm not sure it's a self-portrait by Pablo Picasso. And this is brought in. And I'm not sure if there's another one in this series. Um, I I don't think so. Um, the Try the next one. We could always go back to it later. Yeah, no. That's well, you can leave that up. This is Tom Wolfe. And a lot of what I'm going through here is taken from a number of books and essays by Tom Wolfe, including The Painted Word, From Bauhaus to Our House, Hooking Up, um, the uh, um, the um, the uh, uh, the Kingdom of Speech. Um, he died about 6 years ago, 6 or 7 years ago. He was about the same generation as Lyndon LaRouche. He was, as you can see here, world famous as an impeccable dresser. Wore white suits 365 days a year. You could take him down, take the pictures down. We'll get back to them. But anyway, this is all that was, this stuff was brought in. Now, this was sponsored. All of this was sponsored by, uh, you know, members of the elite class in the United States. Um, it- you know, First of all, you know, I mean, Wolfe describes this as a foreign invasion because all of this, all of this avant-garde, modernist, cubist, and other so-called art was all brought in from Europe, was all brought in from Europe. And then it was sponsored and funded in the United States, particularly in, a handful of locations, most importantly, New York City, by leading members of the American elite and the American oligarchy. For instance, the Museum of Modern Art um, was founded in 1929 in John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s living room. The leading organizer of it was Rockefeller's wife, um, Abby Aldrich Rockefeller. Rockefeller clearly, probably at that time, the richest man in America, certainly one of the top two or three. Abby Aldrich Rockefeller was the daughter of Senator Aldrich, who wrote the first plan to create the U.S. Federal Reserve, and he also was the key sponsor of the 16th Amendment, which brought in the income tax. So Aldrich was a key senator representing Wall Street interests, and these were the networks which created the Museum of Modern Art. The Guggenheim Museum um, was established by the wealthy Guggenheim family in 1939. It was originally called the Museum of Non-Objective Painting.
Oh,
Non-objective painting. There were a lot of people involved in it, but over the decades, the key mover behind it, she was never the head of it, but the key mover behind it was Peggy Guggenheim, who's a real degenerate piece of work. And um, um, she she was in 1938. She had opened a year before the Guggenheim Museum. In 1938, she had opened up a modern art gallery in London, where she featured works by Jean Cocteau and other really, really mentally ill people. Um, and she was the first to exhibit a lot of this surrealist and other bizarre stuff. She moved permanently to Venice in 1947, and the uh, uh, and opened up a foundation there, and lived in Venice for the rest of her life. The Guggenheim Museum is now expanding. They recently opened a branch of the Guggenheim Museum in Spain. That should be the next picture, I think. Next one.
Oh my gosh. The next one?
That one.
Yeah.
That's the Guggenheim Museum in Bilbao, Spain. That's, you know, their idea of what an art museum should look like. And then go to the next one. And this is an artist rendition. They're now in the process of constructing another Guggenheim Museum in, of all places, Abu Dhabi. And this is the artist rendition of what it's supposed to look like, which, as you can see, is even more bizarre than the one in Spain. Now, in addition to the Guggenheim Museum, in 1930, the Whitney Museum was also founded in New York. Um, this was founded by Gertrude Vanderbilt Whitney, and she was born into the extraordinarily wealthy Vanderbilt family, and then she married into the extraordinarily wealthy Whitney family. Um, and these three museums, the Guggenheim, the Whitney, and the Museum of Modern Art, became the primary locations after World War II in popularizing absolutely psychotic art. Um, uh, you know, um, um, worse than the Cubists, if that's possible, worse than Woman Descending a Staircase. And why don't we show a few of these, Tony? This, I don't know the name of this painting. This is by no means taken out of context. This painting is representative of his work. This is
De
by
Kooning. Yeah.
this is by Willem de Kooning. Um, and he was, pushed very hard by the Guggenheim and the Museum of Modern Art. The next one, some people might recognize this as Jackson Pollock. Again, someone else, another person massively, massively pushed by the New York, Boston, Chicago culturati, in after World War II. And then the next one, this is by a man named Mark Rothko. Um, this is considered a masterpiece. Um, and then we have another Rothko, the next one. That's a Rothko hanging on the wall with, I guess, someone admiring it or what have you. But the reason why I put that up is that the painting you're looking at right now by Mark Rothko recently sold at the Southby Auction House in London for $45 million. That painting right there sold for $45 million. This is now what is considered art, right? And this is what has been foisted on us. And it's been done by a very, very, very small number of people. In the book, The Painted Word, Wolfe goes through the fact that there are only about 5 to 10,000 people worldwide involved in this modern art monopoly, not counting the painters, but the people who sponsor this work, the people who bring it into the art galleries, the people who purchase it and bring it into the art museums, you know, super wealthy, super elite, that it's only about 5 to 10,000 people in New York, in Paris, in Milan, in London, in Berlin, and in several other locations. And this really is the triumph of oligarchical art. It has no connection to human beings, no connection to any sense of a positive human identity, of man changing the world. Now, I will also say that the similar things. There's not going to time to go through all this, but similar things occurred in a number of other fields. You can take that down. You know, around the same time, 1900, the 1890s, 1900, 1910, 1920, you get the massive assault on classical music. It began earlier with the Romantic movement, with people like Liszt and Wagner and others. The direct attack on the classical composition of of uh, of Bach, of Mozart, of Beethoven, and others. But again, it's not simply a question of you know notes and technique. Yeah, that's all true. And I'm not a musician. I've never studied music theory. I know very little about musical composition. But it's not just about the notes and what have you, because you know, if you listen to Mozart or Schubert or something, I mean, there is an examination, there is a celebration, there is an astonishment at human creativity. Whereas as you move into the second half of the 19th century, what you get are sensual effects, simply for the sake of sensual effects, simply for manipulating emotion, what have you. The grand sweep of romantic emotion. Again, this is what Heinrich Heine goes after in what was happening to German literature at the same time. You know, um, and the and then by the 20th century, you get atonal music with Arnold Schoenberg. You get what the later sort of evolution of that into what's called serial music, um, all of which is designed at removing creativity from music, removing creativity from music. And again, I'm not going to. That's all I'm going to say about it. But just to make you aware, or to bring up the fact that we're not just talking about painting here. This is also occurring in music. It's also occurring in literature. Um, the you know the I mean, there was good literature written in the United States in the 19th century. I'm not going to tell you which I think was good and which I think was not so good, but there were things that were good. There were things that were okay. But what by the end of the 19th century, you begin to get something else. And then this really, really goes over the brink after the First World War. But it began before the First World War. In uh, uh, 1916, there was an establishment. Again, this is 1 year before the U.S. entry into World War I, 1916. And you get, there was an establishment created in New York City called the Sunrise Turn, a modern bookshop. Now, this was both a bookshop, but also a gathering place, sort of a literary salon for a lot of the up and coming young writers in New York at that time. And it included F. Scott Fitzgerald, it included Theodore Dreiser, it included John Dos Passos, and many, many others. And all of whom were under discussion of creating the new literature, right? And again, whatever you happen to think about any one individual one of these people, right? And I'm not a fan of any of them. I mean, I think Theodore Dreiser is just really awful. But the whatever you think about any one of these individuals, the discussion is the same as the discussion that was taking place in the art world and also in the architecture world with the Bauhaus movement. It's that, we are going to replace the sterile, the old fashioned, the bourgeois values of the old literature, of the old painting, of the old music, of the old architecture. We're going to replace that with a new revolutionary approach. And one of the main things is I mean, you could say a lot about these writers, a lot about them. But in my mind, and other people might have different take on it, but in my mind, you know, one of the clearest things is that if you look at, Scott Fitzgerald, if you look at Dreiser, if you look at a lot of these writers at this time, if you look at Sinclair Lewis, if you look at these people, is the pessimism, the deep pessimism about American culture, corrupt, hypocritical, money grubbing, uh, uh, you know, um, you know, and if you compare that to what people like William Dunlap and others were doing in the 1790s, where they're struggling to create a positive American culture, one which reflects the optimism and hope of the American Revolution. And then you look at what people are beginning to churn out in 1900, 1910, 1920. It's just remarkable. The difference, the night and day difference. And the and the I mean, look, what you get after World War One is, you get the great lost generation migration to Europe. I mean, people have heard of this, but the fact is, unless someone on this call has really thoroughly studied it. I mean, I could tell you that what you have heard about it, you know, the American expatriates in Europe, all of these people, what you've heard about it, um, the reality was far worse, far more bizarre, far more degenerate than anything that you could probably imagine in terms of what was going on. Um, Suicides, mental illness, I mean, just unbelievable. The degeneracy, and this then created the quote unquote literature, and I mean all kinds of people went over there. It wasn't just F. Scott Fitzgerald and Hemingway. All kinds of people went over there. E. E. Cummings, Ezra Pound, William Faulkner, one after the other, Sinclair Lewis, they were all going over there, immersing themselves in literally a cesspool of pessimism and degeneracy. And it's their books which are now prescribed reading in high schools and colleges, which is really pretty amazing when you think about it. The and it got worse actually after World War II. As bad as this all sounds, because after World War II, um, you get you still get this really totally up. By the 1950s, 60s, 70s, you get these totally existential, despairing works of fiction, like from people like John Barth and Thomas Pynchon and these people. And the thing is, they're not even as good a writers as the ones from the 1920s. So it's even like, badly written pessimism. But also in the theater, you get what they call the theater of the absurd. You get people like Bertolt Brecht, you get Samuel Beckett, Waiting for Godot, which was written, I think, in the late 40s, but premiered on Broadway, I think, in 1955 or 1956. And you get many other people like this. Now, some of this comes out of the 1930s, right? Like Brecht. But, after World War II, this stuff is brought onto Broadway or off Broadway or into other cities around the United States. And it's popularized and it's read on college campuses. And this is what was done. You had a similar onslaught in other fields like philosophy and on college campuses. Again, a lot of this has its roots in Weimar Germany, and you have to again recognize the utter despair and pessimism of the culture of Weimar Germany. And out of that, you get people like Walter Benjamin and the Frankfurt School and uh, Karl Korsch and people like that. And this then leads later into people like Jacques Derrida and Michael Foucault. And I mean, then of course, you've got Sartre and Camus, and you got all of these people. You get into the bizarro world of modernism, postmodernism, post-structuralism, which is all like, splitting hairs or counting the number of angels on the head of a pin, of dissecting utter pessimism into 1,000 different varieties, and whose variety of pessimism of the despair of the human condition is the most truthful. And this begins to define, everything that comes out of American college campuses. Um, the Well, I could go on and on, but there's no point in doing it. I'll just mention. There's just no time to go through it. Um, the I'll just mention that in the book From Bauhaus to Our House, Wolfe does the same kind of analysis, Tom Wolfe, of the of architecture. Uh, um, if you want to understand why our cities, and also really the suburbs, but why our cities are now just dominated by sterile, empty, ugly, non-human architecture. This really goes back to the Bauhaus movement, which again began in Germany and Austria as a revolutionary movement, and then almost all of the leaders of the Bauhaus movement emigrated to the United States during the 1930s. And really, by the end of World War II, they were dominant. They were hegemonic. You know, most of the housing projects that were built after World War II, which for anyone who's seen them knows how absolutely ugly they are. This is all based on Bauhaus designs and all of this, but I won't go into that. And then there's also, you know, uh, another book Wolfe wrote, and I'm mentioning these because I'm encouraging people to read them. There's another book he wrote called The Kingdom of Speech, which he devotes the first half of the book to attacking Charles Darwin and Darwin's theory of natural selection. And then he devotes the second half of the book to attacking Noam Chomsky and Chomsky's theories on language from the standpoint that Chomsky's theories on language derive directly from Darwin's theory on natural evolution, natural selection. And it's a really fascinating book. But he just goes through all of this. And look, I know that I'm just sort of going through things, but I'm trying to give you as much of the material as I can. And I think what I'll do, even though this is not the most important thing, I think I'll end by reading to you a quote from Tom Wolfe from The Painted World. No, I think this is from Hooking Up. I'm not sure where this is from. Um, the but the This is where he's describing the lost generation, all the Americans who went to Europe after the First World War. And I just want to read this to you. Wolfe says, quote, after World War I, American writers and scholars had the chance to go to Europe in large numbers for the first time. They got an eyeful of the European intellectual up close. That sneer, that high-minded aloofness from the mob, those long, immaculate alabaster forefingers with which he pointed down at the rubble of a botched civilization. For the Americans, it was irresistible. The European artist, what a dazzling figure. Such creatures stood out against the smoking rubble of Europe after the Great War. The rubble, the ruins of European civilization, was an essential part of the picture. The charred bone heap in the background was precisely what made an avant-gardist such as Breton or Picasso stand out so brilliantly. From the very outset, the attempt of this country cousin, the American intellectual, to catch up with the urbane European model was touching, as only the strivings of a colonial subject could be. Throughout the 20th century, the picture would never change. And today, 100 years later, the sweaty little American colonial still trots along at the heels of Sahib. In the 1920s, the first job was to catch up with the European intellectuals' mockery of the bourgeoisie. H.L. Mencken, probably the most brilliant American essayist of the 20th century, led the way. Now, I just, to give you a sense of Wolfe's writings, but this was the idea, to destroy everything of value, everything which harkened back to the principles of the American Revolution, to just, you know, uh, well, I mean, I don't know what else to say about it. And, I didn't stress as much here as I did in a previous presentation at our conference, how this all really did come from Europe. The architecture, the literature, the existentialism, the Frankfurt School, the music, Schoenberg, and the rest of the Romantic movement. It was, it was a cultural recolonization of America to impose upon Americans a bestial, oligarchical culture. And we're still living under that today. Now, some people might say, well, what does all this have to do with me?
No.
I don't go to the Museum of Modern Art. I don't listen to Schoenberg. I've never seen a play by Samuel Beckett. you know uh this is all for intellectuals. What does this have to do with me? Well, you have to recognize it has everything to do with you, because what has been done has been to impose upon people a culture designed to eradicate that which makes us human. you know to that which distinguishes us from animals. you know we are animals according to these people. We're driven by the most bestial appetites. Life has no meaning, you know, and the this has permeated through the schools, through Hollywood, into every aspect of American cultural life today. And it's foreign, it's deadly, it's the antithesis of what the American Republic stands for. And really, it needs to be rooted out, no toleration. And one of the things I did, which I did not go into, which I'm leaving out, is the whole question of the environmentalist movement, because in many ways that is the worst thing, because it says man is destroying the planet, that the human race, rather than having a positive identity, the human race is destroying the planet. That the essence of being a human being is to be destructive as a species. And this comes out of the Frankfurt School, by the way. Charles Reich and all of these, Rococo Marxists, as Tom Wolfe calls them, in the Frankfurt School. And the first Earth Day in 1970, when most of the baby boomers were in high school or college, the first Earth Day. So, like I said, folks, not a pretty picture. But I thought people should know about some of this. So I'm going to end it right there. Okay.
Yeah, thanks so much, Bob.